So we concluded last week with the establishment of the country, which officially dates from the Declaration of Independence. That was the founding, in fact. But the question remained, and that was one of the high points of unity of the colonies. Sorry about that. But that raised the question of what do we do from here? What's the way forward? And for that, there had to be considerable debate and discussion. And the way I want to present this is, well, how revolutionary was what came out of the Declaration, which was clearly a unique point in history to found a government, to found a country on the principles that were laid out in the Declaration. So there are many arguments today, as you undoubtedly are aware, against saying the American government, which emerged, what continued to be revolutionary. One of them, which has a partial truth to it, is that in fact it was not a radical revolution, it was a conservative revolution, because many of the Americans were thinking that they were saving rights that they had already had as Englishmen that were being taken away by the monarchy. So that is, now one can argue, and I would do so, and numerous scholars have, that those principles, which the colonists called the rights of Englishmen, were never really in effect in England. And therefore it was radically revolutionary to put them into effect in a government on this side of the Atlantic. However, that's one argument. The other very, very popular is that this was basically a fight between two oligarchies, the oligarchy in Britain and an oligarchy which had emerged in the colonies, which wanted control. They just objected to another part of those entitled people taking the riches. There's also the wild theory that the Americans wanted to make a revolution because they wanted to save slavery, and the British were on the verge of taking away their slaves. And then there is the argument made that there was really no radical change whatsoever, because the people who, I mean, it is true, the revolution in the colonies of the Americas was led by people of the, what you would call the upper classes, the educated classes. So, and those people thought that they were those with merit to form the government and so forth. So many people think, are misled to think, I believe, that made a mockery of the ideas in the Declaration. And there's also, of course, the Beard thesis, strong argument that is made and very popular in many circles, that the Constitution, the revolution was a radical egalitarian operation at the time of the Declaration, but with the Constitution, there was effectively a counter-revolution that put together a change in power from the people to this elite. Now, none of these, you might imagine, is my view. And my argument is that the preamble, as in the Declaration, is the core. that is the principle. And that commits us to establishing a republic capable of fulfilling the aims of the Declaration, that there is a continuity of and consonance between those two documents and their attempted implementation, and that is the way that we have to view, and I propose to look at the facts that will support that idea. So what is a republic? That maybe is one of the first ideas. These days, all you hear is saving our democracy, saving our democracy. And the word democracy was used not only, I mean, sometimes in a very negative way among the founders, but positive way by many of them. But they were thinking of a representative democracy or a democratic republic. And I would say that a republic, I mean, you look on the internet and they're crazy, very widely varied ideas of what a republic is. But I think that the core of it is what you have in front of you here. It's a form of government where the public good is the primary concern of the government, and the citizens see their own general welfare as consonant with the welfare of the state and use their freedoms to ensure that outcome. And they play an active role in ensuring that this is the case. And that pursuit of the public good is the key to happiness for both the individual and the state. So that does not give you a pure democracy. It gives you what I said before, a representative democracy or democratic republic. The population is necessarily has to give its consent to the activities of the government, participate in the government, but from that standpoint of the public good and the consonance of the public good of an individual with the welfare of the state. And the way many of the founding fathers saw that is it's the law which is king, which is a phrase from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, that you are formulating a legal basis or a constitution that ensures the public welfare, the common good, and that it's that, not the individuals who are in power, who are going to determine what the course of your government. That is what has to be your guidepost, not the individuals. This is a Lady Justice. I'm sure I've seen beautiful statues of this. This is not so beautiful, but nonetheless is a classical representation of sorts. Now, that said, we have to be clear about one additional item before we get into further discussion, which is that the war for independence is different from the revolution. This is something that both Benjamin Rush and John Adams in particular made very strong arguments about. Because, many people get very excited about the fact we won the War of Independence, although much too frequently they eliminate the absolutely essential role of the French in making sure that we did that. But the fact is here that the revolution is something different. The revolution is that change in the ideas of the people that we discussed last time and how they judge how their government should be, the principles on which their government should be formed. Rush gave a very interesting and informative address on this question right on the eve of the Constitutional Convention, which I've given you a certain quote from here. And effectively, he's saying that unlike what John Adams said, which is we had a revolution in our thinking about government and how we should participate in government and the principles on which that is, prior to the Revolutionary War, he's saying the Revolutionary War was the beginning of that kind of, or a continuation of that change, but that change was not complete. The change had to continue to actually be enshrined in a form of government where we would implement those ideals. And I think that's more accurate. I think it's more of it harkens more to the ideas later of Lincoln and others in the Republican small r tradition. And one of the sticking points that I think you should keep in mind as we discuss the question of our Constitution emerging out of the revolutionary ferment and the war is this question of power. Because, of course, many of the advocates and participants in and leaders, in fact, of the revolution shared with the radical Whigs of England this idea that power was almost per se something to be opposed. Any powerful figure in the government, any centralization, this is, had to be questioned from the very beginning. And there was a great reluctance to actually realize that power can be used for good, and that without good, without power, you may be absolutely helpless to ensure the good. This is reminiscent to me of the famous section from one of Leibniz's essays where he discusses this question. But that is, keep that in the back of your mind, because that was a point of tension throughout the entire period, not only in the period up to establishing the Constitution, but afterwards and up to today, I would say, very much a live issue. So now the first step following the Declaration was actually was both the war, which was obviously took primacy because we were defending against military assault, but was the establishment of state constitutions, not a federal constitution. The first resolution that was passed prior to the Declaration of Independence was John Adams's on May 15th, 1776, where he declared that we should all the assemblies, I see all the colonies, right, should actually replace their royal governments, because as of now, we don't recognize the government of England as powers over us. So, and this began, in fact, in some cases, it had already begun well before May of 1776. Colonies all throughout began to rewrite what the way they made laws, who had the power to enforce those laws, and so forth. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina. In some cases, of course, these were absolutely these changes in government were absolutely necessary to even pass the Declaration of Independence, because the standing legislatures at that point, with their governors, I mean, think Benjamin Franklin's son in New Jersey, for example, were an impediment to being able to pass the Declaration. So that was done for that purpose, but also overall, the idea was to change those governments in a way consonant with the new idea of how Americans, how the population should relate to the government, how its powers in the government, to determine what they wanted and what they didn't. So that was done right away. And the characteristics of those new state constitutions, besides being friendly to the Declaration, which that was a successful operation, was that basically they diminished the powers of their governors, increased the size of their legislatures. They did maintain the bicameral system for the most part, except for Pennsylvania. They maintained property qualifications for voting in almost all cases, but lowered them in many of those situations. They had an emphasis on putting the citizens' rights into writing. 5 of those new constitutions had bills of rights, but they also were extremely unstable, because there was a tendency to say that every decision that was made had to be reviewed by not only necessarily people in the lower house of the state governments, but also the population at large. So they were constantly rethinking laws. You couldn't rely on a law that was passed for necessarily lasting from one year to the next, because there was an increased distrust of anything that was passed by a government. This may sound familiar to you in terms of of a certain ideology which was rampant at the time in this period of revolutionary change. It was a period of revolutionary change. People were consciously talking about us experimenting with new forms of government, but it was extremely unstable. It was unstable financially. There were strong measures against people against merchants, and some of which were probably deserved and some of which may not have been deserved. Actions to relieve debtors, some of which may have been very important to do because the debts were illegitimate, but others were just were illegitimate to do. But because of this whole idea of a revolutionary change, and the will of the people dominating, it was extremely unstable. And in some cases, eventually in Rhode Island, there was almost a civil war at that point within the revolutionary movement, within the anti-British movement, between the countryside and the city, or the debtors and the creditors. I don't know exactly how you would precisely describe that. So, but there were at the same time some fundamental shifts in the Republican direction, that direction of establishing a republic based upon the primacy of the public good, and eliminating certain kinds of oligarchical privileges which stand in the way. There was disestablishment of some of the religious demands for that required you to pay taxes to a certain religion, more tolerance of various religions. This varied from colony to colony, obviously. The establishment of religion in New England, well, it definitely existed with the Puritans, and they weren't too kind to the Baptists. Down here in Virginia, it was the Anglican Church, and they also tortured the Baptists. Those practices were gone against and actually put in the new constitutions in places like Virginia. So there was a removal of feudal inheritance laws, primogeniture, the way you can leave your property to your offspring, an amelioration of criminal punishment. Some of that had already proceeded earlier, but it accelerated in this period. Freedom of speech, and initial measures to ban slavery. That those began in the course of the war. The first colony, which didn't even exist as a colony at the time, the first state, Vermont, which was declared itself a republic in 1777, and they were the first to ban slavery. But there were also, in 1780, both Pennsylvania and Massachusetts made moves. In 1784, Rhode Island and Connecticut, and loosening of restrictions against manumission began to move at that time. So these were fundamental shifts, establishment of abolition societies and so forth. So it was a revolutionary changes were underway, but in a situation of the war and considerable instability where you couldn't say we're really in a position to work on the general welfare in a full way, including economically, which is obviously critical. Now, in the course of all this, there was consideration, obviously, being in the war and needing to coordinate all these militias and activity of all the states. It was necessary to have a coordinating body, the Confederacy. And this, interesting to look at the Articles of Confederation. This is just a little bit of it, and you'll see, just think of it in contrast to the Constitution as it later is established. So it's the United States of America, fine. But the second article is every state has its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and very jealous of the power of the states. And what's the aim? Not union, but a firm league of friendship for common defense, security of liberties, mutual and general welfare. But is it possible to actually implement that in this form? I think we'll see that is not the case. So very early, of course, it took a long time for that Confederation, Articles of Confederation, to actually be implemented. It didn't happen until 1781. You were well into the war by that time. And well before that time, actually, even starting around 1779, 1780, there are voices for a different kind of confederation, an actual constitution. And the first voice that we know of that's public is Alexander Hamilton's. There are private letters before, but in 1782, 83, he had issued a series of papers called the Continentalist Papers, which argued for revamping and increasing the powers of the central, the coordinating body, or the Congress. He drafted a resolution for the New York State legislature calling for the National Convention. And he drafted such a resolution as a congressman when he was there in 1782, 1783, but decided not to introduce that because he couldn't get anyone to support him even prior to the introduction. The Continentalist Papers posed the following three subjects for expanded powers of the National Congress: a need to regulate trade and to have a source of income. He changed later on his concept of what to get your income from, but these were the initial ideas that he put forward in 1782. So, and it's in the Continentalist Papers that he gives a very interesting idea of one of the historical precedents that he's thinking of for pulling the nation together, which is to talk about Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister for Louis XIV, who is credited correctly with having broken down the feudal system to create a national economy with government, through government action in France. So this is just the particular section where he discusses that, which is really gives you an idea of where he's going when it comes to his own promotion for manufacturers and nation building later on, when he's in a position to do so. Now, in the course of all this activity, creating new state governments, then changing those constitutions, discussing the whether, how to finance the war, and what powers the national body of the Congress should have, there comes, and the war is won, right? The war is won with the overwhelming support of the French. And the Treaty of Paris is actually negotiated with the British deciding that they don't want to put any more resources in trying to put down the American war. So that Treaty of Paris is also a very interesting element in the discussion in the United States about what to do in setting up a permanent government, because part of that treaty involved allowing the British to collect on bona fide debts, having loyalists be free from prosecution just because they opposed the Americans in the war, and that and to agree that the British should not keep those Negroes whom they had taken. Now, what was most unpopular about this, of course, was the idea of paying debts. This is but the desire on the part of those who negotiated this was that if you simply declared, well, which we used to do, a debt moratorium willy-nilly, the United States would never be able to have any credit whatsoever. So bona fide debts could not be willy-nilly wiped out, according to the Treaty of Paris. And loyalists should not be prosecuted or penalized just because they were loyalists. There's sort of a Treaty of Westphalia aspect of this. We should move together to have a lasting peace. And then obviously the question of the enslaved. Now, that is more complicated, obviously, because it shouldn't have happened really, but and certain people opposed it, and it didn't go into effect. In fact, the British did not bring back the blacks. They actually did have thousands and thousands of blacks freed enslaved people leave with them. What happened to them varied considerably, wasn't necessarily good. But people like Alexander Hamilton, in fact, argued that we shouldn't stick to that provision that should, because it would be highly immoral to do. And it was never pursued. But there was tremendous upset about these provisions it's just part of the picture of what's happening as after the war is won, and the question is on the table: what do we do now? So, what problems were we facing under those circumstances? One is physical devastation, right? This is a depiction of the destruction of New York, but that's by far not the only place where things were wiped out. In fact, most of the devastation occurred in the South, in Virginia, South Carolina, and so forth. You had the huge debt, the foreign debt, which hadn't been paid for years, not even the interest, domestic debt to those who had advanced money in one way or another, or supplies, many farmers and so forth, and then debts that the states themselves incurred. And that created a problem for being able to carry on trade and commerce. In some states, there was crushing taxation to pay those war debts. Most notably in Massachusetts, of course, where you had the Shays Rebellion, which began in August of 1786. You had the impact of British economic warfare in the past, where industries had been, in fact, productive plant had been destroyed, but you also had continued or expanded economic warfare by the British immediately after the war had officially ended. They were determined that to flood the United States with their own manufactures, so as to prevent those activities from being successful. The British forts were still on US territory, and the fleet was interfering with the potential for international trade. There was still the Caribbean colonies of the British were off limits. That was not a change. So there was economic warfare, which the United States was facing. There was interstate conflict because of the difficulties of commerce and the destruction of productive activity, but particularly the difficulty raising money. You had states at each other's throats, for example, around tariffs. So things that were coming into harbors that were effectively active in more than one state. For example, New York Harbor, to which people came when they were sending stuff to Connecticut or to New Jersey or to New York. Well, if New York decides that New Jersey and Connecticut have to pay them in order to move those goods through the harbor, that created a certain amount of animosity, hardly great union between those states. And then, of course, we had a government of the Confederation government with no powers and no income, and very often no people. They just didn't show up because it didn't appear as though they would be able to do too much. So that's where we were, the state constitutions were functioning, although, with a fair amount of instability. The national picture was weak, and there was disarray economically, which was very threatening to the future of the country. So under these circumstances, great minds began to think of, well, how do we pull this country together? How do we actually realize the potential that we declared with the Declaration of Independence? How do we create a stable and growing sense of prosperity for the welfare of our people, as opposed to being at each other's throats? I mean, all the things that you may recall reading about in the Federalist Papers were very real in terms of the on-the-ground situation in this, say, 1782 to 1787 period. Now, the calling of the Constitutional Convention, what led to that? As many of you may know, the immediate impetus was economic impetus. This is the Potomac River. George Washington had established the Potomac Company, I think, in 1785, but there had to be negotiations between Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland in order to actually make the ground rules and allow the work to go ahead to try to make the Potomac navigable. So they attempted to pull together the Annapolis Convention to create the basis for this kind of interstate collaboration for economic development, in fact. Now, that was a failure in many respects, because I think only 5 of the states came, not too many people. But those who did included Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who determined to act anyway. And as you may know or not, Hamilton was the one who wrote the call for the Constitutional Convention, which came out of that Annapolis Convention. This was not, you could certainly say this was not a democratic decision. It was an initiative of leadership to say, look, the basis on which we're acting as a country, or even a league of friendship, which was what the Confederation was calling itself, is just not working. We're not able to do the positive things that we really want and need to do, and a lot of negative things are happening. So we need to have a convention of the states. That Constitutional Convention, then a date was set in that call. The Congress does do something very important. They forward that to all the state legislatures who appoint delegates to the Constitutional Convention for May of 1787. Everybody comes except Rhode Island, and the Rhode Islanders are too much involved in their own fighting among themselves to bother with what's happening on the national level. So they don't come. What were the main issues of contention? This is my summary, a very brief summary. I'm not going to go into these things in huge detail. If you want to ask about them later, I'll have more to say. The one that is played out most, as you may know, is, of course, whether we are going to be sorry about that, whether the new government will be, as the Confederation, a government of the states or of the population, which will be the basis of, and in that regard, in a sense, there is a compromise because the Senate has representation by states, 2 per state, whereas the House of Representatives is represented on the basis of population. But overall, the voting for those, and initially, of course, the Senate is elected. The representatives of the Senate are elected by the state legislatures. They're not elected by the population per se. They're not popularly elected, even though the legislators are popularly elected, the state legislatures. So this is a major bone of contention. And until that compromise is made, it's not clear things are going to go ahead. Then the question of what kind of executive. Some people wanted to have the executive elected by the 2 houses of Congress. Others wanted to not have an executive at all. Others wanted to have a 3 people, or and then so that was a huge issue, which was resolved by having the president popularly elected. Then the question is, how much power does this new set of institutions, federal institutions, have relative to the states? And that's a question of enumerating the powers of the federal government. Major issue of contention on slavery, which is where both South Carolina and South Carolina is the spokesman, actually, and Georgia say that they will not participate if slavery is banned right away, if the slave trade is banned right away. And they also are making demands which for representation of the enslaved population in the Congress. They actually would like to have an additional vote for every single enslaved person. And then the question of the Bill of Rights, whether we should have a Bill of Rights. And there were numerous people who refused to actually support the Constitution because there was no Bill of Rights instituted at the convention itself. Now, Hamilton's view of what Hamilton organized the Federalist Papers, and he wrote the first one to lay out his overall view of what we were actually about in establishing the Constitution. And in his view, we were this was a world historical event. The question is whether you can have a union decided upon by the people of the United States, of a country, without it being done by force of arms, without it being a question of accident or the fact they all spoke the same language or whatever, but based upon reflection and choice. And I would add certain fundamental ideas in the Declaration. We can form actually a government. That this is what we're actually looking at. And as with the Declaration, the actual purposes of that government are outlined in the preamble. And this is, and you may know that the preamble was not deliberated on by at any length, and I'm not, from what I've read, not hardly deliberated on at all. It was written at the end of all the debate about the particularities of our form of government by a committee of style, which included Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton, and 2 or 3 other people. So this is, but it is as with the Declaration, a distillation of the principles behind the particularities, to make sure that people bring to mind the actual purposes for which we are having a new national government. The Constitution as an institution, and we discussed last week, the British did have a constitution, but their constitution was basically, we have 3 castes of government, and they are the ones who decide what the laws are going to be. Here, the Constitution is not defined by that kind of form. It's defined by setting up certain principles, which are outlined in the preamble, and then certain procedures by which those are to be carried out. And very significantly, it was ratified directly by the people. It wasn't ratified by the state legislatures, but by special elections at special ratifying conventions done specifically to determine that constitution. And there was very, active debate over that ratification, as you probably are aware. Particularly heavy debate in Virginia and in New York. This is, I'm sorry, this is Patrick Henry. It's not Henry Clay. Anyway, Patrick Henry opposing the Constitution in Virginia, and which he did on the basis of the fact of the too much power in the federal government, which might eliminate, which he didn't like, period, because of this idea that any concentration of power was dangerous to liberty, but he also didn't like it because it might eliminate slavery, which he said explicitly. So you did have that active debate everywhere, but most virulent in those places. Now I'm going to do the Constitution's unique Republican features. It is the longest lasting written Constitution in the world, and the shortest, because it does it does set up a set of procedures to implement certain purposes, but it's made deliberately flexible. And this is stated by John Marshall, interestingly enough. This is a quote from his 1819 decision on the National Bank, where he was being asked to determine whether, because the National Bank is not, the right to establish a national bank is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, it's lawful for the constitutional for the federal government to set it up. And he says, yes, absolutely, because the purposes outlined in the Constitution are implemented by this institution. And if you insist that everything we're going to do is detailed in the Constitution, and I believe there are some constitutions in the world that are written these days which attempt to do that, you could never have a successful government. You only have the great outlines marked, the important objects designated, and the minor details, the specifics are subsidiary to that. So this is the concept behind it. You have the principles, you have the purposes. It's a constitution. It's not an infinite set of particular laws. And that's one reason it has lasted for as long as it has, because most other countries have changed their constitution numerous times. As I indicated, there was broad involvement in the ratification, great variation in how many representatives were at these ratifying conventions. Here you see Massachusetts had 370, Virginia 170, Pennsylvania 69, New York only 65, although initially it was a great preponderance of anti-federal, anti-constitution representatives. It was debated over 9 months through all the states. It was submitted in September of 1787 and was the final ratification didn't occur. The 9th state did not ratify until June of 1788. And the Federalist Papers, which we're all familiar with and were the most encompassing of the elaborations on and arguments on the Constitution, were just one of a zillion articles that appeared in all these newspapers in order to discussing the Constitution. There's a whole book, maybe some of you are familiar with, called The Anti-Federalists, which is a compilation of all the newspaper articles against the new federal government. This is just a precursor, probably, of what I'm going to be discussing next week, which is really more on the role of Alexander Hamilton per se in pulling the government together. But this is from Federalist. It gives you a good idea of some of the major thinking of what Hamilton thought we were pulling together with this Constitution, creating a union. See, it's a shift, big shift of League of Friendship to a union that's going to create a new system that's strong enough not to be kicked around by these empires. The Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government. This is a unique and revolutionary thing. It says no title of nobility shall be granted, not only not by the United States, but also not by the states. which I suppose some may have objected to. No property or religious qualification for office. This is quite extraordinary, really, because you did have that on all the state levels, but on the national level, there are age limits for how old you had to be in the House of Representatives and how old you had to be in the Senate, but not for not to be elected. You didn't have to have that at all. So now there's no reference. Okay, these I'm saying, let's forget what there's nothing of. We can discuss that later. The right to a jury trial is definitely there in the Constitution itself, in writing. And an extensive section on federal powers over the economy, because as should be clear from what I was discussing on the economic situation coming into the Constitution and its role in motivating the pulling together of the Constitution, this was a major purpose of and a major element of being able to secure the general welfare and the survival of the country. I mean, we were surrounded by empires. The British were carrying out economic warfare. They were not reconciled to, the British Empire was not reconciled to our continued existence. And so a major section of the Constitution is to lay the basis for building a successful economy. And the only way that clearly could happen is to give powers to the federal government. So that's all laid out in Article 1, Section 8 on the power, the question of credit, general welfare. This is the second time. It's the only thing that's mentioned twice in the Constitution. It's in the preamble and in Article 1, Section 8, that the general welfare of the country is the primary consideration. Borrow money on credit, regulate commerce, uniform rules of naturalization, coin money. States are not allowed to coin money. Establish post roads and post offices. This is very significant from the standpoint of creating national unity, promoting the progress of science and useful arts by patents. I don't think that's necessarily the only way that was intended to do. This whole other section is on the military, which I've left out, and then make laws all necessary and proper to carry out these powers. Very important phrase, which we run into in the fights over the powers of the federal government that erupt continuously and continue to erupt today. The presidential powers, keep in mind in the Constitution, the first article is on powers of the Congress. As I remember, I said the revolutionary changes in the state government all really put emphasis on the power of the legislature. Well, the Congress, the Constitution of the United States gives a lot of power, a preeminence to the House and the Senate also in terms of laying out what their responsibilities are. The presidential powers come second, and they're to execute the laws. Although the very important purpose of, in war, the commander-in-chief, and this recommending measures for implementation of the Congress, which are attached to the State of the Union here, but need not necessarily, in my view, be limited to being in the State of the Union. Now, major question relevant to the book that I just wrote is the question of what the Constitution did on slavery. And this is the title of a chapter in my book on the Constitution, on the Constitution, where I say compromises and promise. What was, it was clearly a compromise in order the view of the most virulent anti-slavery members of the Constitutional Convention was that slavery was on the way out. I mean, there are numerous of the delegates who say they believe that's the case, that ending the slave trade, even 20 years later, was a way of ensuring its death, or helping its death. And certain measures were taken to, and they also did resist the major demand of the slaveocracy, which is that the enslaved be counted as a whole person in Congress, making it 3/5. But they did certain things that they thought ensured that slavery could be considered on its way out. There was an attempt, I think, by a representative of South Carolina, it was probably Rutledge, to put into the Constitution a specific reference to slaves as property. That was voted down. There was a determination with the ratification of the Northwest Ordinance, which was one of the first things that the new Congress did, of the Congress's power over the territories, which could have meant eliminating the possibility of the expansion of slavery, which of course became one of the major elements of leading to the Civil War. So it was clearly a compromise, but in the determination of the outcome of that compromise was, as various authors have said, as Frederick Douglass has said, Sean Wilentz, who wrote a very important book called No Property in Man, said, is slavery ended up being tolerated as a state institution, but not enshrined in the national constitution. It was tolerated as a state. Freedom was national, slavery was state. Now, all these things were before there was a Bill of Rights, the previous guarantees of republicanism, jury trial, etc. Obviously, some significant rights were granted, were enumerated in the Bill of Rights. There were strong advocates for the Constitution that didn't think it was necessary. I don't know what I think about that, really. It seems that the Bill of Rights has become very useful. But these were demanded by certain states. It was demanded by certain states that they would only ratify if a Bill of Rights was considered, or they ratified it and added a codicil that a Bill of Rights should be considered in, and the Congress delivered on that very soon. So how revolutionary was the American Revolution? What kind of government? Did we end up with a revolutionary government? I would say that if you look at the other governments at the time and you look at what was accomplished in the direction of establishing a free republic, we did turn the world upside down, as was sung at the surrender at Yorktown. And if you want more on that slavery question, I recommend my book. And that, folks, is where I am.